as to the question of how, if the war is over, I think we're still a long way from peace in Sudan.
Khartoum is free, it's over. Those are the words of Sudan's General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. But the war is far more complicated than this victory implies, and it's likely that what follows will be too. The current troubles in Sudan began 2 years ago when rival generals of the armed forces who had ousted ex-President Omar al-Bashir in a 2019 coup d'etat turned against one another. But what started as a conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces, or SAF, who were led by de facto President al-Burhan, and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by the general known as Mekki, has exploded into bloody chaos with countless militias, ethnic massacres, and foreign proxy self-interest. Farmland and crops have been razed by explosives, gunfire, and climate change, feeding a famine that is projected in the most dire readings to kill 10,000 people a day. Over 25 million people, more than half the country's population, face acute hunger, and people are being forced to eat grass to survive. 11 million have been displaced, leaving over 2 million families homeless. And somewhere between 28 and 200,000 people have been slaughtered. Official death tolls come from hospital counts, with 4 out of 5 hospitals shut by the conflict. The true scale of that death toll is likely far higher than official reports. So is Sudan finally free of its troubles? Joining us to shed light on the situation is Ameen Mekki, a UK-based Sudanese activist and creator of the Instagram info page Sudan Updates. Hello, Ameen.
I think it's definitely a significant achievement for the Sudanese Armed Forces. I think it's definitely a significant loss for the RSF. Whether to say that the war is now over or not, I think that the answer to that question is it's definitely not over. The RSF, although losing Khartoum was a big step, a big step back, obviously, for the RSF, and a big loss, both strategically and morally, as obviously they've been the capital for 711 days. So since the war started, the RSF still has a stronghold in the west of the country, in Darfur and in parts of Kordofan, as well as the surrounding areas around Khartoum city, so greater Khartoum state. There's been reports that there are still, pockets of RSF fighters in the surrounding areas in Khartoum state. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction in eliminating the RSF and establishing a peace of some sort. But I think as to the question of how, if the war is over, I think we're still a long way from peace in Sudan.
For clarifying that, we have seen celebratory footage coming out of Port Sudan, which has become the de facto base of the military government since Khartoum was captured 2 years ago. Can you just talk us through the different reactions among Sudanese people to this conflict, to this development in the conflict?
I think for the most part, it's been there's been an overwhelming sense of relief. People living under the RSF controlled areas have all described living under the horror, the oppression, the kind of just abysmal situation that they've been living under for over 2 years now. We've seen stories of rampant sexual violence and sexual abuse. We've seen torture. We've seen indiscriminate, drone strikes and killings, and it's been honestly horrific. All of the videos, sorry, that I have been seeing coming out of from Khartoum at the moment have been just people, celebrating and being in disbelief and in overwhelming happiness that they no longer live under the RSF occupation. And I use the word occupation because that's what this is. They've been occupying civilian homes, hospitals, schools. We've seen reports of citizens and civilians being used as human shields. They have been detained, they've been starved. There are countless videos of emaciated um, prisoners, essentially, that, who are civilians and have no, background with the army, and they're it's horrific, horrific. The description and the level of suffering, it cannot be described. Um, and I think that for almost everyone in Sudan is this is kind of is relieved in a sense.
Actually, I hope you don't mind me asking, Amin, but how has today's news been for you? You're constantly immersed inundated with content coming out of Sudan, and you have been one of the most persistent eyes on the country, from the outside looking in for 2 years of the hell that you've just described. How are you feeling today?
I think, like most people, I do feel a sense of relief. Um, I am very obviously happy at the defeat of the RSF and the major losses that they have been, um, you know, getting. For me, I've been following this obviously for 2 years now. So I think, and it's just seeing and being exposed to the amount of suffering on the ground. I'm just hoping for, peace at any cost. We've seen horrible levels of suffering. Sudan is the world's worst humanitarian crisis in modern record. It's also the world's worst hunger crisis and largest displacement crisis in the world. So it's really an unimaginable scale of suffering right now happening in the country. Um, the sooner that we move towards peace, the sooner the people can start to rebuild their lives, the sooner that Sudan can, come out of this cycle of violence and war and killing. Um, Obviously, there are so many layers to this, um, and it's coming from the place of where I saw Sudan going before the war. So in 2019 onwards, there was so much hope in the country. There was so much just people really believed, there was so much faith in the fact that Sudan was going forward and Sudan was moving forward and transitioning, obviously post the 2019 revolution. And I think the war was just this huge kind of shock, kind of, because some people also, with hindsight, could see this coming. But I mean, I don't think anyone really like expected the just absolute scale of destruction that's happening across the country. So I feel like um, any step towards establishing peace is relief for me, and I think it's something that should be celebrated cautiously as well, just because of kind of the history of the actors that are involved in this conflict.
Revival of that hope that was felt back in 2019. Something I find myself wondering about is how Sudanese refugees must be feeling. I think Sudan has the grim title of being the biggest child displacement crisis in the world. Millions and millions of Sudanese are displaced within the country and also have been expelled all over the world. But, when Syria toppled its dictator in December, many were celebrating, but in the same moment, governments around the world started shutting down asylum routes and saying refugees can go home, talking about returns of Syrians. I think a question that a lot of people are asking now, with Sudan is the war over? Is there hope of a homecoming, or is it too soon to be jumping to that conclusion?
Yeah, as I said before, we're cautiously optimistic about this win, but I think that the war is, again, it's far from over as of right now. I think that it's a significant gain, but I don't think we should be, packing up our bags and going back yet. I obviously have my whole family, extended family, and have been displaced. So I've been witnessing it kind of firsthand, seeing their reactions. And I think that everyone, again, there's been this kind of relief and this sense of hope again in going back and returning back home. Because another thing that I would like to point out is that most people a lot of people that suffered and have been displaced in the war have been displaced multiple times. So there are people that were in the capital Khartoum and were displaced again to Medellin and displaced again to Port Sudan. So there's been a theme of um, displacement over and over again. And I think for those people, they they definitely feel relief because many of those people were displaced by the RSF, obviously moving south to Medini and moving to other areas. We know that most South-controlled areas tend to be relatively safe, excluding obviously Darfur and other areas where there's been constantly fighting. But we know that there's been a kind of everyone's, I think, been at a kind of um, I think general mood has been low just before this point. Obviously, go just like a month back or a couple of weeks back, the SAF launched their major counteroffensive and have started to gain ground. And I think that's when people started to kind of um, gain hope and regain momentum in the idea of going back home to Sudan and whatnot. I think obviously we're going to be facing again like huge amounts of destruction and infrastructural destruction and just based off of the way and the nature of this war and its focus and destruction happening in cities and around crucial civilian infrastructure. It's going to be a very long time until that we have some semblance of stability and kind of a safe and stable country.
SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces who you're referring to there, they have not been totally innocent in terms of well-being of civilians and protection of human rights during this conflict. You talked about damage to infrastructure, harm to civilians, but also aid. You said there's a massive famine in Sudan, so even if the fighting was to come to an end, there would still be that to deal with. The Sudanese army has been documented in some cases blocking aid, weaponizing aid, as well as the RSF. So I suppose my question, is you talked about the occupation being over. How much faith is there in the incoming military government to, restore well-being for civilians?
I think I can't speak for all of Sudanese people, but I can speak for myself and kind of how I'm kind of looking at this, just based off of the lessons of Sudan's past. I think when I use the word cautiously optimistic, I am optimistic in the sense that um, a SAF obviously will hopefully result in the RSF being defeated, and I think that is a step towards stability of some sorts of piecing of achieving a fragile peace. But I think at the same time, there's a significant amount of the society that feels a sense of distrust towards SAF as the establishment. I know there's a lot of civilians and civilian volunteers who have been recruited and kind of joined their ranks to fight the RSF and fight them off and kind of help with the effort to free the country, if you will, from the horrors and the terrors of the RSF, sorry. But I think that we still should be careful in kind of moving forward, and especially post-war and post-war Sudan, in studying what the Burhan and the other military leaders' positions are going to be in any post-war Sudan. We've seen that the military establishment historically and the historical crimes have been working in the counter revolution. And that's another important point that I would like to bring up is that Sudanese scholars and activists are calling this a multi-scalar counter-revolutionary war, in the sense that it is a war against the revolution and it is a war also against the people of Sudan, who rose up obviously to achieve civilian democratic governance and to achieve a Sudan that encompasses everyone, as the revolutionary slogan goes. SAF is, yes, as you pointed out, SAF is also historically guilty of committing crimes, war crimes in regions like Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, and in South Sudan, obviously. And it is obviously the power that, what the RSF is kind of their brainchild, or the brainchild of the former regime of Umar al-Bashir. Um, so I think moving forward, we should be very cautious and cautiously optimistic. I think I most people are definitely, you know, ag- pro, defeating the RSF. And I think in that sense, you would assume that would make them obviously pro-SAF. But I would also like to point out that this isn't necessarily a binary. We don't have to see things in this black or white view, if that.
Goodie and a baddie story. We've got to keep watching. And I guess that brings me on to my final question, which is the world's eyes are on Sudan today, but events there rarely make headlines, at least compared to the scale of the crisis. You have a social media initiative trying to drive continuous focus in what's happening in Sudan. So do you welcome the media attention that it's getting today? And what would you say to the international community while its eyes are on Sudan right now?
I mean, I definitely welcome the media attention. Most um, it's been a pleasant change, obviously, but the whole reason why I've created a platform like Sudan Updates and other average Sudanese people have come and used their own tools, and social media being the biggest one of them, to kind of raise awareness, because there's been this absence of Sudan in the media. We've been called the world's forgotten crisis, but I think most Sudanese people like to use the word ignored, because it does feel like we're being ignored. The resources are out there, the voices are out there. There are so many journalists working on the ground to kind of bring this news out, but I think that most people are unfortunately just choosing not to kind of listen and center Sudanese voices on basically how we need the world to kind of respond to this. We obviously know that the media attention also has a significant impact on things like foreign aid and diplomatic ventures to kind of pressure both sides to stop the fighting, as well as pressure the foreign powers that are involved in this war to stop the funding and the complicity in this war. And another part I would also obviously like to highlight that I don't think has been highlighted is the fact that although the war in Khartoum is over, again, I would like to just highlight again that the rest of Sudan is still suffering. There, I mean, a village in North Darfur called the Tura was 3 days ago bombed in an airstrike, and that killed over 100 people. And there's again other statistics that 15,000 households in North Darfur have also been displaced just 3 days ago, and in the 48 hours, according to the Darfur Women's Action Group. So I I know that right now we kind of feel a sense of relief and a sense of happiness, but I think that the world needs to keep focusing on their attention on Sudan, and we need to keep our eyes on Sudan, and especially focus on the marginalized areas, especially outside of Khartoum, where the war tends to be more bloodier anyways, because there's not that lack of attention, and those are the areas that have historically been suffering from the state violence, that is genocide and all these other war crimes. um,
For anyone who wants to keep eyes on Sudan, you can follow Ameen's work on social media at sudan.updates. Ameen Mekki, thank you for joining us.